friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using Mama Elephant's Jump for Joy and You've Got Mail. So I've stamped those images out on Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, and I'm going to be coloring to match some pattern paper from the Pebbles Sunny Blooms 6x8 pad. So I'm just going to flip to the sheet that I want to use, and I'll tear that out and tuck that under my cardstock panel so that I can choose my Copic markers to match. So I am going to jump right in with my bunny, and I'm going to use E50, E51, E53, and E55 for him, starting with that E55 to lay in some shadows down the back of the body. And I'm going to leave the belly and the front of the face white, so I'm just being cautious about where I'm placing those colors. And then I will start to blend that out with the E53, making sure to go right over the edge of that E55 so I can pull that darkest color into this lighter shade. And then I'll come in with the E51, which is mainly going to be my highlight. The E50 is just going to be to add a little bit of transition from the brown to the white. So the E51 is actually kind of like the lightest in the brown areas. And then, like I said, I'm just going to go over the edge of that E51 with the E50 and let that fade into the white cardstock on the lower part of the face and the belly and the little tips of the paws. Then I'm going to darken up this combo by keeping the E53 and E55 and adding in the E57. And I am going to do the post for my mailbox. And I did manage to squeeze in all three of those shades. You really don't have to. Two would have been plenty because it's such a skinny little area. But I did add in that third shade, the E53, so that I would have a little bit of a highlight on the front of that wood post. Then I'm going to move on to my squirrel, and I'm going to color that to be a red squirrel, as that's my favorite animal. And I'm using E11, E13, E15, and E17. And you may notice that the bottom of that image looks a little bit funny, and that is because I masked off one of the critters. So the bunny is actually sitting on the head of a bear, but the entire image would have been too tall, so I only wanted the bunny and the squirrel for this particular scene. So I just took a post-it note and put that over the pile of cards after I had stamped it, and then stamped the other image with the critters over top. And then when I go to die cut, I will die cut the letters first, and then I'll die cut the pile of critters. So I'm moving on to my mouse. I'm using my favorite combo for mice, which is W00 with E70 and E71. So E71 toward the back of the body, blended out with the E70, and then the W1 is just going to kind of fade into the face and belly. And then for the bird, I'm doing a bluebird using B00, B41, and B45. My B45 is running pretty dry though, so even though I love the way the bird was looking, I decided to swap it out for the cards, and that will also help the bird stand out a bit because he'll be just slightly darker than the envelopes. So I swapped out the B45 for the B52, and I'm going to use that as my darkest on a bunch of these different envelopes. So I'm just picking and choosing different ones throughout the pile that are not right next to each other and coloring a few of them, starting with the B52, blending out with the B41, and then I'll use the B00 for the highlight. So that is pulling directly from one of those stripes in the pattern paper. I want to have all of those stripes represented in this little pile of envelopes, or at least in this scene. So I'm just hopping around and trying to space them about evenly and not forget the letters that are poking out of the bag or the mailbox. Next, I'll switch to some pinks. I'm going to bring in R000, R11 and R20, and first I'm going to just give my critters some rosy cheeks and also color the inside of the bunny's ears. So I use the R20, blend it out with the R11, and then just for the bunny I also use that R000 since he was a bit lighter. And then I'll use all 3 shades to do a bunch more of these envelopes. And since they're all in this big jumbled up pile, it's kind of hard to figure out where your light source should be. So I'm not going to be too careful about it. I'm basically just shading any of the creases or anywhere that another card is overlapping and would cause a shadow. But I'm not being too particular about it. If it's not quite right, it's totally fine. Nobody's ever going to notice in this giant pile if one isn't shaded correctly. So don't stress too much about it if you're coloring an image like this. Once I have my pinks, I am going to just do the bunny's tail. I forgot to do that with the W00 when I had that out. And then I'll move on to my mailbox, and I'm going to do that in dark green. So there's actually 2 different colors of dark green in that pattern paper. There's one that is quite dark that is like the second stripe in from the very top left corner of the white cardstock. It's like a dusty blue and then the dark green. But then there's also a green that's also dark but not quite as dark as that first stripe or that center stripe. So I am doing the mailbox in this darker combo to represent the darker green in that pattern paper with G21, G24, and G28. And then for the envelopes, I'll take away that G28 and add in the G20. So the G24, which was my mid-tone, is now going to become my darkest shade. And then the G21 will be the mid-tone and the G20 will be the highlight. So again, I'm just picking and choosing different envelopes, making sure that they're not right up next to each other so I can really spread those different colors throughout the scene. And I'm just doing the darkest shade first. I'm also going to do the small little envelope in the mouse's hands. He's probably my favorite image in this stamp set, even though red squirrels are my favorite. Just because he's so cute and tiny. I love little tiny critters, and he is drawn so beautifully. This stamp set is illustrated by Ada Zamora for Mama Elephant, and I am especially drawn to her designs. I think she is such a talented illustrator. I'm just in awe of her craftsmanship. So I'm moving on now to kind of like a sea foam green, which is also in that pattern paper. And I had a hard time finding something that was a complete representation for it, but I think this is pretty close. The G quadruple zero, G00, and GO2 is the combo that I'm using. The GO2 is a little bit bright, but once I add in the other 2 shades, it kind of mutes it down quite a bit, and so it's the closest that I could get to that stripe. So I'm pretty happy with how it looks in there. I think it's a nice, bright, fresh pastel shade that goes well with the pinks and the dusty blues that are in there. This is such an interesting combination of colors, which was what drew me to it for this card, because you've got some really pastel shades in there, and then you've got the dark green and the dark red and the gold foil, and I just think altogether it's something really interesting. And the pattern paper, for some reason, it reminds me of airmail, even though it's, you know, so many more colors in the mix than a typical airmail would be. But the blue and the red tones are very similar to airmail, at least as I remember it. I used to have to send airmail letters to my husband when we were engaged because we were living in vastly different countries. I had come back to the United States, and he is from Germany, but he was living in Africa at the time before we ended up moving to Africa. And so I would send him airmail letters because that was just the cheapest way to be able to communicate, because he didn't really have email out in the rainforest, so no form of cell communication or phone communication was possible at all back then. So anyway, I moved on to one of my red combos. I'm going to do two different red combos. I first used R20, R22, and R24, trying to match the red in that pattern paper since it's not quite a bright red, but I felt like this was still a little bit light. So I am going to do a slightly darker version of this as well because I just had so many more envelopes to color. So R24 first is what I'm using for this one, blended out with R22, and then R20 is my highlight. And then I'm going to darken it up just slightly by taking away the R20 and adding in the R29. And so I'll start with that for my darkest, also starting to fill in some of the little slivers of envelopes that you can see in the pile that are kind of hidden behind the main envelopes that you can see better. And I'm also going to do the flag of my mailbox with this combo. So I'm just going to use the R29 for the skinny arm part of it, but then I'll blend that out with the R24. And I only used those two shades on the flag and on some of the envelopes that were a little bit more buried as well. But for any that you could see, you know, most of it, I would also add in the R22 to have a bit of highlight. I'm also going to do the open envelope with this red combo so that it can clearly be a love letter. So just kind of outlining the edges of the folds there and blending toward the inner part of each of those sections. Then I'm going to switch to E40, E41, and E42. And I'm going to do the letter to look white with just a little E41 and E42. And I'll also do some of the envelopes here and there with just those two shades. It just adds a hint of shading that still enables them to look white, but gives them a little bit more dimension. So, and gives them a little bit of shadow since they are in this big pile. And then some of the letters I'm going to darken slightly as if it's more of like a cream colored cardstock or maybe even like a pale craft. So on those, I'll start with the E42 and then blend out with the E41 and use the E40 for a highlight. So two different colors with just the three shades of markers there. And now that I have exhausted all of the colors in that pattern paper, I'm just going to go around and fill in any remaining with just the E40 and E41 so that they'll look white. I think it's fine to have plenty of white in the mix. It also helps the other colored ones to stand out a bit more. So once I have everything filled in, I will also color in the sack of letters. And I wanted that to look kind of like a burlap sack, so I'm going to darken this combo up just slightly with the E43. That's going to become my darkest around the edges of that little bag and also in any of the creases that are drawn. And then I'm going to work my way toward the center with the E42. I'll bring in some E41. And since I had it out, I also added in a little E40 in the center. Then I'm going to try to tie in the gold stripes with Y21 and Y26 for those little details on the post. And then I'll grab a black Sakura Jelly Roll pen and get that started off the side and go over the eyes of all of my critters to make them bright and shiny. And then I will trim all of these images out with their coordinating dies. For my background, I'm using a piece of Bristol smooth surface cardstock that I've trimmed down with one of the Mama Elephant Pika frames. It has a little postage stamp edge, which I thought would tie in perfectly with the theme of this card. I've also got a little basin of water and an acrylic block, and I'm going to press some Distress Oxides onto that. So I used Tumbled Glass, Stormy Sky, and Rustic Wilderness. And I'm just going to paint a little watercolor background on here. Very simple and easy to do, and it's just going to help tie in with the coloring, but it's not going to overtake it because it's just going to be very soft and kind of organic. I'm leaving the edges white and just adding a little bit of color here and there. I don't want it to get too dark and to compete with the images, just to help them kind of stand out against the background. So I'll paint about 3/4 of it blue, and then down at the bottom I'll add a little bit of the green. You're barely gonna see any of the ground because that envelope pile is so large, but just a little bit of it will show, so I wanted to make sure to add that in there. So I'm just going to go back and add a few extra little parts here, kind of mixing those blues together a bit more and adding little areas that are a bit darker or a bit lighter. And then once I'm happy with how it's looking, I will set this panel aside to dry completely. While that's drying, I'm going to go back to my pattern paper and also back to the Mama Elephant Pica frames. This time I'm going to do the largest die, which just has some stitching details around the edges. And I'm going to line that up where I want it on the pattern paper. I wanted that gold stripe to be about even in the top left and bottom right corners. Since it is such a prominent feature of this pattern paper, such a thick stripe, I wanted to make sure it looked balanced on the card. Now that the background has dried, I'm going to pop that in my MISTI so I can stamp my sentiment using the Mama Elephant Essential Tags sayings. And I'm using some VersaFine Onyx Black ink and stamping out "Hello Friend." I didn't have a lot of room for the sentiment, so I needed it to be something short and sweet, and that just fit in perfectly and I thought went well with the theme. And then on the inside, I am stamping another one of the images from You Got Mail and You're the Best from the Essential Tag sayings. It didn't stamp out great the first time. I think I've never used that sentiment before, so it might have had a little residue from the manufacturer. So I cleaned it off with my stamp chamois and stamped it again. That was a little better, but the E and the B were a little bit dull, so I stamped them a third time, and that was much better. So now I'm ready to start assembling. I'm going to take that pattern paper and adhere it to the front of my card base. It is an A2 standard size card, so it's 4 1/4 wide by 5 1/2 tall. And then I've added some foam tape to the back of the focal panel, so I'll peel off those release papers, line that up in the center of my card, making sure I have equal amount of that pattern paper showing on all 4 sides, and then pop that down into place, and then I can bring in my images. So I'm going to take the large pile of envelopes and use that as a placeholder down at the bottom so that I can get the positioning of my mailbox just right. So my idea for this card was that these critters are actually not sending mail but receiving it. So they came to the mailbox to see if their friends had sent them any letters, and when they got there, they discovered that their friends had sent so many letters that they were just coming out of the mailbox, and that the mailman had had to leave an entire sack full of them, and there was still a huge pile down on the ground, which I just thought was super fun. So I am tucking the little mouse into the slit that the die makes in that pile of envelopes. And then I'm going to get that ready to adhere, and I'll also get my little stack of critters ready to adhere. I'm going to get them placed right below that sentiment and then line up the pile of envelopes right over top. So the reason they're all holding envelopes is because they're already sorting through the mail to see what letters are for whom, and so one of them is already open. So I was just trying to decide where the love letter was going to go. I kind of liked it down at the bottom of the scene, but I felt like there was a gap toward the base of the mailbox that just needed to be filled with something, so I decided to add it there instead. And then my mouse wasn't quite as well adhered as I needed him to be, so I just glued him back down. And then I wanted to add more gold to this card since we have those 2 gold stripes in the pattern paper. I wanted to just reinforce that a bit by adding some gold sequins. So I am picking those up with a Studio Katia embellishment wand and then adding a drop of glue underneath and then just pressing them into place with the back side of the wand. And then I decided to add one more over on the right hand side there. And then I'm going to let that dry for about a minute, and then I will fill in the holes of the sequins with some Stardust stickles. I just think that makes them look a little bit more finished, and it also is another opportunity to add a touch of glitter to a scene. And I also decided to add it to the heart on the love letter just to draw extra attention to that little detail. And that is going to finish up this card. I'll lift that up so you can see all of that gold detail and give you another peek at the inside. I had so much fun coming up with this card concept and bringing it to life, so I really hope you guys enjoyed it too. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and leave me a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet, and ring that notification bell if you want to be alerted when I post new videos. All the products I use will be listed and linked in the description bar in case you'd like to pick up anything for yourself. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I hope you had a good one, and I will see you soon in another video. Bye-bye!